The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Charles stood at his bedroom window, watching the gardeners tend to the roses below. His reflection stared back at him, showing a man who had waited decades to wear the crown that now sat heavy on his head. The weight wasn't just from the gold and jewels, but from the choices that had brought him to this moment. Camilla was still sleeping in the bed behind him. Her breathing was steady and peaceful, but Charles felt anything but peaceful. Last night's state dinner had been a success by all accounts, yet something had shifted inside him during those formal hours. He had watched Catherine, his daughter-in-law, as she moved gracefully through the evening, speaking with dignitaries and making everyone feel welcome. There was something about her genuine warmth that reminded him of someone he had lost long ago. The palace staff had begun their morning routines, and Charles could hear the distant sounds of preparation for another day of royal duties. He turned away from the window and quietly made his way to his study, careful not to wake Camilla. The hallways of the palace seemed longer in the early morning light, and his footsteps echoed softly on the polished floors. In his study, Charles found the daily briefings waiting for him, along with a cup of tea that had been prepared exactly as he liked it. But instead of reaching for the papers, he found himself thinking about the previous evening. During the dinner, there had been a moment when Catherine had looked at him with such understanding in her eyes. It wasn't romantic or inappropriate, but rather the look of someone who truly saw the burden he carried. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had always been complicated, even after their marriage. They had found their way to each other after years of separation and public scrutiny, but Charles sometimes wondered if they had been holding on to a dream from their youth, rather than building something real for their present. Camilla understood his position as king, but she had never quite understood the loneliness that came with it. Catherine, however, seemed to understand both the public and private sides of royal life in a way that impressed him. She had married into the family as an outsider, much like Diana had, but Catherine had found her footing more successfully. She carried herself with dignity while maintaining her authenticity, something Charles admired deeply. The morning progressed with its usual schedule of meetings and appointments. Charles met with his private secretary to review the day's agenda, then had a brief audience with several ambassadors. Through it all, his mind kept wandering to the growing distance he felt from Camilla and the unexpected connection he was beginning to feel with Catherine. It wasn't that he was falling in love with his daughter-in-law. That would have been inappropriate and destructive to his family. Instead, it was more like recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who understood the unique challenges of their position in ways that others couldn't. Catherine had shown remarkable strength during difficult times, and she had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person the royal family needed. During lunch, Charles ate alone in his private dining room, a habit he had developed when he needed time to think. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. He thought about his sons, William and Harry, and how different their lives had become. William was thriving in his role as heir, largely because he had Catherine by his side. Harry had chosen a different path, one that had taken him away from the family. Charles realized that part of what he admired about Catherine was how she had helped William navigate the challenges of royal life. She had brought stability and genuine happiness to his son in ways that Charles himself had struggled to find. Perhaps that was why he felt drawn to her presence, not romantically, but as someone who represented the kind of partnership he had always hoped to have. The afternoon brought more official duties, including a meeting with government ministers about upcoming state visits. Charles performed his role with the practiced ease of someone who had been preparing for it his entire life. But his thoughts remained elsewhere. He found himself looking forward to the evening's family dinner, knowing that Catherine and William would be there. As the day drew to a close, Charles returned to his private quarters to find Camilla getting ready for dinner. She was applying her makeup at her dressing table, and they exchanged pleasantries about their respective days. But Charles noticed that their conversation felt more like a routine than a genuine connection. They were going through the motions of a married couple without the deeper understanding he craved. Camilla talked about her afternoon engagements and the people she had met, but Charles found it difficult to focus on her words. His mind was already moving ahead to dinner, to the possibility of meaningful conversation with someone who truly understood his world. He felt guilty about these thoughts, knowing that Camilla deserved better than a husband whose attention was wandering. The evening air was cool as Charles walked through the palace corridors toward the family dining room. He had changed into more casual clothes, though even his casual wear was impeccably tailored. The family dinners were supposed to be more relaxed affairs, a chance for them to connect as people rather than as public figures. When he entered the dining room, William and Catherine were already there, chatting quietly while they waited for the meal to begin. Catherine looked up as he entered, and her smile was warm and genuine. She asked about his day, and Charles found himself giving a more honest answer than he usually would. There was something about her presence that made him feel like he could lower his guard slightly. As they sat down to dinner, Charles made a conscious effort to engage more with Catherine than he did with Camilla, who was sitting across from him. It wasn't entirely intentional at first, but he noticed that Catherine's responses to his questions were more thoughtful and engaging. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was really listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. The evening marked the beginning of a shift that Charles didn't fully understand yet, but one that would change the dynamics within the royal family in ways none of them could have predicted. The weeks following that dinner passed in a blur of official engagements and public appearances. Charles found himself paying more attention to Catherine during their family gatherings, though he tried to be subtle about it. He noticed how she handled difficult conversations with grace, how she made everyone around her feel comfortable, and how she seemed to genuinely care about the people she met during royal duties. Camilla, meanwhile, continued with her own schedule of engagements. She had carved out her role as queen consort with determination, supporting various charities and causes that were important to her. But Charles began to notice that their conversations at home had become increasingly superficial. They talked about schedules and public appearances, but rarely about their thoughts, dreams, or fears. One rainy Tuesday morning, Charles was reviewing correspondence in his study when his private secretary knocked and entered. There had been a change in the schedule for an upcoming charity gala, and Catherine would need to step in for Camilla, who had fallen ill with a minor but persistent cold. Charles felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of attending the event with Catherine instead. The gala was being held to raise funds for children's hospitals, a cause that was close to Charles's heart. He had been patron of several children's charities for years, and these events always reminded him of why his position could be used for good. As he prepared for the evening, Charles found himself taking extra care with his appearance, though he told himself it was simply because the event was important. Catherine arrived at the palace looking elegant in a midnight blue gown that complemented her natural beauty without being ostentatious. Charles felt his breath catch slightly as he saw her, but he quickly composed himself. They would be traveling together to the venue, giving them time to discuss the evening's program and the people they would be meeting. In the car, Catherine reviewed her notes about the charity and the key donors who would be attending. Charles was impressed by how thoroughly she had prepared, especially considering she had only learned about the assignment that morning. She asked thoughtful questions about the charity's work and seemed genuinely interested in making the evening successful. The venue was a historic hotel in central London, and photographers were waiting outside as their car pulled up. Charles stepped out first, then turned to help Catherine from the car. As their hands touched briefly, he felt a warmth that seemed to spread through his entire body. Catherine smiled at him gratefully, and they walked into the hotel together, presenting a united front for the cameras and the waiting crowd. Inside, the ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed guests, all eager to meet the king and the future queen. Charles watched as Catherine moved through the crowd, making genuine connections with people rather than simply going through the motions of royal protocol. She remembered names, asked about family members, and showed real interest in their stories. During dinner, Charles and Catherine were seated at the head table, and their conversation flowed naturally. They talked about the charity's work, but also about books they had read, places they had traveled, and their hopes for the future of the monarchy. Charles found himself sharing thoughts and opinions that he rarely expressed to anyone, and Catherine listened with genuine interest and understanding. At one point during the evening, Catherine placed her hand briefly on Charles's arm while making a point about education reform. The touch was innocent and appropriate, but Charles felt a jolt of electricity at the contact. He looked into her eyes and saw something there that he hadn't seen in years, a connection that went beyond the polite interest of family members. The speeches portion of the evening went well, with both Charles and Catherine delivering remarks that were well received by the audience. Charles spoke about the importance of supporting children's health care, while Catherine shared a personal story about visiting a children's hospital and meeting young patients who had shown incredible courage in the face of illness. After the formal program ended, there was dancing, and Charles found himself wondering if it would be appropriate to ask Catherine to dance. The decision was made for him when she suggested they should dance together, pointing out that it would be good for the photographers and would show unity within the royal family. As they moved onto the dance floor, Charles placed his hand on her waist and took her hand in his. Dancing with Catherine felt different from dancing with Camilla. There was an ease and natural rhythm that seemed to develop instantly between them. Catherine was an excellent dancer, and Charles found himself remembering why he had once loved dancing so much. They moved together perfectly, and Charles felt more relaxed and happy than he had in months. Other guests began to join them on the dance floor, but Charles was barely aware of anyone else. Catherine was smiling up at him, and her eyes sparkled with genuine enjoyment. For a few minutes, Charles forgot about royal protocol, public scrutiny, and the complications of his personal life. He was simply a man dancing with a woman who made him feel alive again. When the dance ended, Catherine thanked him graciously, but Charles noticed that she seemed slightly breathless, and there was a flush of color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. They returned to their table, but the atmosphere between them had shifted subtly. There was an awareness now that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. The ride back to the palace was quieter than the journey to the gala. Both Charles and Catherine seemed lost in their own thoughts, and the air in the car felt charged with unspoken tension. When they arrived at the palace, Charles walked Catherine to her car, which was waiting to take her home to William. As they said goodnight, Charles took Catherine's hand to kiss it formally, as was traditional. But instead of the brief ceremonial gesture he had intended, the moment stretched longer than it should have. Catherine looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and Charles found himself reluctant to let go of her hand. Finally, Catherine gently withdrew her hand and thanked him for a wonderful evening. She got into her car and was driven away, leaving Charles standing on the palace steps watching the taillights disappear into the night. He knew that something had changed between them during the evening, and he wasn't sure what it meant or what he should do about it. Back in his quarters, Charles found Camilla already asleep, having recovered enough from her cold to attend a small private dinner earlier in the evening. He stood looking down at her for a long moment, feeling a complex mix of guilt, confusion, and longing. He cared for Camilla, but what he had felt tonight with Catherine was something he hadn't experienced in years, if ever. The morning after the gala, Charles woke earlier than usual. He had slept fitfully, his dreams filled with images of dancing with Catherine and the feeling of her hand in his. As he lay in bed, listening to Camilla's steady breathing beside him, Charles tried to make sense of what had happened the night before and what it meant for his family. He knew he needed to be careful. The monarchy had survived many scandals over the years, but the current generation was supposed to represent stability and moral leadership. Any hint of impropriety between him and Catherine would be devastating not just for the royal family, but for William and their children as well. Yet Charles couldn't deny that something had awakened in him during those hours at the gala. At breakfast, Camilla was feeling much better and wanted to hear about the previous evening. Charles gave her a careful account of the event, praising Catherine's performance and the success of the fundraising efforts. But he found it difficult to meet Camilla's eyes as he spoke, afraid that she might see something in his expression that would
give away his true feelings. Camilla seemed pleased that the evening
had gone well and made some comment about Catherine being a valuable asset to the family. Her words were kind, but Charles detected a slight coolness in her tone when she mentioned Catherine. He wondered if Camilla had noticed his growing appreciation for his daughter-in-law, or if he was simply feeling guilty about his own thoughts. The next few days passed with Charles trying to maintain his normal routine while fighting the urge to find reasons to spend time with Catherine. He had always been disciplined about his duties and personal conduct, but now he found himself distracted during meetings and unable to focus on the documents that required his attention. On Thursday morning, Charles received word that Catherine would be attending a private meeting about one of his environmental initiatives. She had become increasingly involved in causes related to early childhood development and education, and this particular project involved creating sustainable learning environments for young children. Charles had initiated the project months earlier, but Catherine had shown genuine interest in contributing to its development. When Catherine arrived for the meeting, she was wearing a simple but elegant suit in a soft green color that brought out her eyes. Charles noticed that she seemed slightly nervous, which was unusual for her. She was typically very composed during official meetings, but today there was a subtle tension in her demeanor that hadn't been there before the gala. The meeting was held in Charles's private office, with only his environmental advisor and Catherine's private secretary present besides themselves. They reviewed the plans for the project, which involved converting several old buildings into modern, eco-friendly learning centers for disadvantaged children. Catherine had prepared thoughtful suggestions for the educational components, and Charles found himself genuinely impressed by her insights. As the meeting progressed, Charles noticed that Catherine was making an effort to maintain professional distance from him. She addressed him formally as Your Majesty, rather than the more casual Charles she sometimes used in family settings. Her suggestions were presented clearly and concisely, but without the warmth and personal connection that had developed between them at the gala. When the other attendees left the room to gather some additional documents, Charles and Catherine found themselves alone for the first time since that evening. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken awareness of what had passed between them. Charles wanted to say something about the gala, to acknowledge what had happened, but he couldn't find the right words. Catherine spoke first, her voice carefully controlled. She thanked him for including her in the project and said how much she looked forward to seeing it come to fruition. Her words were appropriate and professional, but Charles could see in her eyes that she was thinking about the same things he was. The connection they had felt while dancing, the moment when he had held her hand longer than necessary, the way the evening had ended with both of them reluctant to say goodbye. Charles wanted to reach out to her, to bridge the distance she was trying to maintain, but he knew it wouldn't be appropriate. Instead, he simply thanked her for her contributions to the project and said he valued her input. The words felt inadequate for what he really wanted to say, but they were all he could safely offer. When the others returned to the room, the meeting concluded quickly. Catherine gathered her papers and prepared to leave, but as she reached the door, she turned back to Charles. For a moment, their eyes met, and Charles saw a flash of the same longing he was feeling. Then Catherine looked away and left the room, leaving Charles standing alone with his thoughts and his growing sense of conflict. That evening, Charles had dinner with Camilla in their private dining room. She was in good spirits, talking about her upcoming engagements and sharing gossip from her afternoon tea with some friends. Charles tried to participate in the conversation, but his mind kept wandering to Catherine and the careful way she had maintained her distance during their meeting. Camilla seemed to notice his distraction and asked if everything was all right. Charles assured her that he was simply tired from a busy week, but he could see in her expression that she wasn't entirely convinced. There had always been an understanding between them that allowed for certain distances and separate interests, but this felt different. Charles was pulling away not because of work or duty, but because his heart was moving in a direction that threatened everything they had built together. After dinner, Charles retreated to his study to work on some correspondence, but he found it impossible to concentrate. He kept thinking about Catherine's suggestion during their meeting to include art therapy in the learning centers. It had been a brilliant idea, one that showed her deep understanding of how children learn and grow. But more than that, it showed her capacity for seeing beyond the obvious to find creative solutions to complex problems. Charles realized that what he was feeling for Catherine went beyond physical attraction or even emotional connection. He was genuinely impressed by her mind, her character, and her approach to the responsibilities of royal life. She had grown into her role with grace and intelligence, becoming exactly the kind of person he had always hoped to have as a true partner in his work. The thought disturbed him because it forced him to confront the reality of his marriage to Camilla. They had come together later in life, after both had experienced other relationships and disappointments. Their marriage was based on affection, shared history, and mutual support. But Charles was beginning to realize that it lacked the deeper connection he craved. As he sat alone in his study, Charles made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He would not actively pursue anything inappropriate with Catherine, but he would also not pretend that his feelings didn't exist. He would continue to work with her on projects they both cared about, and he would see where those interactions led. It was a dangerous path, but Charles felt compelled to follow it, even if he couldn't see where it would end. Outside his window, the palace gardens were shrouded in darkness, but Charles could imagine the roses that would bloom there in the spring. Change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not, and all he could do was try to navigate it with as much honor and integrity as possible. Spring arrived early at the palace that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that Charles hadn't felt in a long time. The gardens were coming alive with new growth, and the longer days seemed to energize everyone around him. But with the changing season also came new challenges and opportunities that would test the boundaries Charles had been trying to maintain. The environmental project that Charles and Catherine had discussed was moving forward rapidly, and they found themselves working together more frequently. Their meetings were always professional and properly chaperoned, but Charles couldn't help noticing that Catherine seemed more relaxed around him than she had been immediately after the gala. The careful distance she had maintained was gradually giving way to a more natural interaction. One particular morning in April, Charles was reviewing architectural plans for the learning centers when Catherine arrived for their scheduled meeting. She was carrying a folder of research she had gathered about successful educational programs in other countries, and her enthusiasm for the project was evident in her animated explanation of what she had discovered. As Catherine spread her materials across the conference table, Charles found himself watching her hands as she gestured. She had beautiful hands, graceful and expressive, and he remembered how perfectly they had fit in his while they danced. The memory sent a familiar warmth through him, and he had to force himself to focus on the papers. She was showing him, Catherine, had found examples of programs in Scandinavia that combined environmental education with traditional subjects in ways that had dramatically improved student outcomes. Her research was thorough and thoughtful, and Charles was impressed by the depth of her understanding. As she explained her findings, their heads bent close together over the documents, and Charles caught the subtle scent of her perfume. The proximity was both comforting and troubling. Charles felt a strong urge to reach out and touch her hand, to somehow bridge the careful gap they maintained between their professional collaboration and the personal connection they both felt. But he restrained himself, knowing that even the smallest gesture could be misinterpreted by others or lead them both down a path they weren't ready to navigate. Their work session was interrupted by the arrival of William, who had come to discuss some scheduling conflicts related to upcoming royal visits. Charles watched as Catherine's entire demeanor shifted when her husband entered the room. She smiled warmly at William and moved naturally to his side, and Charles felt a sharp pang of something that might have been jealousy. William was clearly devoted to Catherine, and she to him. Charles could see the easy affection between them, the way they communicated with small gestures and shared glances. It was exactly the kind of partnership that Charles had always hoped to have, and seeing it made him acutely aware of what was missing in his own marriage. After William and Catherine left together, Charles remained in the conference room, staring at the papers she had left behind. Her research notes were written in her careful handwriting, with small observations and ideas noted in the margins. Charles found himself studying these personal touches, trying to understand the mind behind them. That evening, Charles had a state dinner to attend with Camilla. Foreign dignitaries were visiting, and the evening would require several hours of formal protocol and carefully managed conversation. As Charles adjusted his formal wear in front of the mirror, he tried to prepare himself mentally for the performance that royal events required. Camilla looked elegant in a burgundy gown, with her jewelry chosen to complement the formal nature of the occasion. She had become expert at these events over the years, knowing exactly how to engage each guest and make them feel honored by the attention. But as Charles watched her prepare, he realized he was comparing her to Catherine and finding her wanting. The comparison wasn't fair to Camilla, who had her own strengths and had adapted admirably to royal life. But Charles couldn't stop himself from thinking about how Catherine would have handled the research project they had discussed that morning, or how she would have interacted with the foreign guests they would meet that evening. During the dinner, Charles performed his role flawlessly, making conversation with each guest and ensuring that everyone felt welcomed and respected. But part of his mind was elsewhere, thinking about Catherine and wondering what she and William were doing that evening. He imagined them at home with their children, sharing the kind of domestic happiness that had always eluded him. After the guests had departed and he and Camilla had returned to their private quarters, Charles found himself unable to sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit gardens and thinking about the choices that had brought him to this point in his life. He had waited so long to become king, and now that he finally held the position, he felt more isolated than ever. Camilla had fallen asleep easily, exhausted by the evening's social demands. Charles looked at her sleeping form and felt a wave of tenderness mixed with sadness. She had given up a great deal to marry him and take on the role of queen consort. She deserved better than a husband whose thoughts were increasingly occupied by another woman. The next morning brought news that would force Charles to confront his feelings more directly. There had been a minor crisis at one of the children's hospitals that the royal family supported, and Catherine had volunteered to make an unscheduled visit to help calm concerns and show support. Charles decided that he should accompany her, telling himself that the presence of the king would add weight to the gesture. When they arrived at the hospital together, Charles was struck by how naturally Catherine interacted with the children and their families. She had a gift for making people feel comfortable, and even the sickest children seemed to brighten when she spoke with them. Charles found himself following her lead, letting her guide their interactions in ways that felt more authentic than his usual formal approach. At one point, Catherine knelt beside the bed of a young girl who was recovering from surgery. The child was shy and had been reluctant to speak with the staff, but Catherine somehow managed to coax a smile from her. As Charles watched this interaction, he felt his heart swell with an emotion that was becoming harder to deny. When Catherine looked up at him from beside the child's bed, her eyes were bright with unshed tears of compassion, and Charles felt something inside him shift permanently. This wasn't just attraction or admiration anymore. He was falling in love with Catherine, and the realization terrified him. The drive back to the palace was quiet, with both of them seeming to sense that something important had happened during their hospital visit. Charles wanted to tell Catherine how moved he had been by what he had witnessed, how much he admired her compassion and her natural way with people. But he also knew that saying those words would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Instead, he simply thanked her for her excellent work and said how valuable she was to the royal family. Catherine accepted his thanks graciously, but Charles could see in her expression that she understood there was more he wanted to say. The unspoken communication between them was becoming as clear as any words they might have used. As they arrived back at the palace, Charles realized that he could no longer pretend his feelings were simply professional respect or family affection. He was in love with his daughter-in-law, and unless he found a way to distance himself from her, he was going to destroy everything he cared about. The weeks following the hospital visit became a period of internal struggle for Charles that tested every principle he had lived by. He found himself making excuses to avoid family gatherings where Catherine would be present, claiming urgent state business or prior commitments that didn't actually exist. But even as he tried to create distance, he found his thoughts returning to her constantly. Camilla began to notice his changed behavior. She commented on his distraction during their private conversations and asked if he was feeling unwell. Charles assured her that he was simply dealing with the pressures of his role, but he could see that she wasn't entirely convinced. Their relationship, which had never been deeply passionate but had been comfortable and supportive, began to feel strained in ways that Charles hadn't anticipated. One evening in late April, Charles was working late in his study when he received a call from William. There had been a minor accident at their country home, nothing serious, but Catherine had twisted her ankle while walking in their garden. William was calling to let Charles know that they might need to cancel some upcoming engagements until Catherine recovered. The news sent a jolt of concern through Charles that was far stronger than what would have been appropriate for a family member. He found himself asking detailed questions about Catherine's condition and whether she was receiving proper medical care. William seemed touched by his father's concern, not realizing that it went far beyond normal family worry. After ending the call, Charles sat alone in his study, staring at the phone and acknowledging to himself just how deeply his feelings for Catherine had grown. The thought of her being hurt even slightly caused him genuine distress. He wanted to go to her, to see for himself that she was all right. But he knew that such a visit would be impossible to explain. Instead, Charles found himself composing a careful note expressing his concern and hoping for her quick recovery. He wrote several drafts, each time trying to strike the right balance between appropriate family concern and the deeper feelings he was trying to hide. Finally, he settled on a brief, formal message that could have been sent by any caring father-in-law. The response came back the next day, written in Catherine's careful handwriting. She thanked him for his concern and assured him that her injury was minor and healing well, but at the bottom of the note, she had added a single line that made Charles's heart race. "I hope we can continue our work on the children's project soon." The personal nature of that addition, the way she had moved beyond the formal response to express something that mattered to her personally, suggested to Charles that she was thinking about their time together as much as he was. It was a small thing, barely more than professional courtesy, but to Charles it felt like a lifeline connecting him to someone who understood him in ways that no one else did. Charles's behavior during this period didn't go unnoticed by the palace staff, who had developed a keen ability to read the moods and relationships of the royal family. His private secretary mentioned that several people had commented on the king's distracted state, and there were whispered conversations about what might be troubling him. The situation came to a head in early May, during a formal garden party at Buckingham Palace. It was one of the season's most important social events, with hundreds of guests from various walks of life invited to meet members of the royal family. Catherine, her ankle fully healed, was scheduled to attend alongside William, while Charles would be accompanied by Camilla. Charles tried to prepare himself mentally for seeing Catherine again after several weeks of limited contact. He told himself that he would maintain appropriate distance and treat her exactly as he would any other family member. But when he saw her arriving at the palace wearing a flowing dress in soft yellow that made her look like a spring flower, his resolve wavered. The garden party followed its traditional format, with members of the royal family moving through different sections of the crowd, engaging with guests and making everyone feel welcomed. Charles found himself constantly aware of where Catherine was, even when he was focused on his own conversations. He caught glimpses of her laughing with guests, listening intently to their stories, and gracefully handling the endless stream of introductions. About an hour into the event, the predetermined rotation brought Charles and Catherine together in the same section of the garden. They were supposed to work as a team for this portion of the party, introducing each other to guests and supporting each other's conversations. It was a normal part of royal protocol, but for Charles it felt like both a gift and a torture. Standing beside Catherine, Charles was reminded of all the qualities that had drawn him to her. She was charming without being artificial, interested in people without being intrusive, and elegant without being distant. When she introduced him to guests, there was a warmth in her voice that suggested genuine affection and respect. At one point, an elderly gentleman asked Catherine about her work with children's charities, and she mentioned the environmental learning project she was developing with Charles. The pride in her voice as she described their collaboration sent a thrill through Charles that he tried desperately to hide. She spoke about their work as if it was something special and meaningful, not just another royal duty. During a brief moment when they were walking between groups of guests, Catherine spoke quietly to Charles about some ideas she had been developing for the project during her recovery. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Charles found himself drawn into a detailed discussion about educational philosophy and environmental awareness in young children. As they talked, walking slowly across the perfectly manicured lawn, Charles became aware that they had unconsciously moved closer together. Catherine was gesturing as she spoke, and at one point her hand brushed against his arm. The contact was brief and innocent, but it sent electricity through Charles's entire body. Without thinking, Charles reached out and gently took Catherine's hand in his, ostensibly to guide her around a small obstacle in their path. But once their hands were joined, he found himself reluctant to let go. They continued walking for several steps with their hands clasped, and Charles felt a sense of rightness and completion that he had never experienced before. Catherine didn't pull away immediately, and for those few precious moments, Charles allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if they were free to explore the connection that existed between them. Her hand felt perfect in his, and he could see in her expression that she was feeling the same confusion and longing that tormented him. The moment was broken when they approached another group of guests and had to separate to perform their duties. Catherine gently withdrew her hand, but not before giving Charles's fingers a small squeeze that could have been accidental but felt purposeful. They spent the rest of their time together maintaining careful professional distance. But the damage was done. After the garden party ended and the guests had departed, Charles found himself alone with his thoughts and the memory of Catherine's hand in his. He knew that he had crossed a line that afternoon, and he wasn't sure there was any way back. The connection between them was no longer something he could dismiss as imagination or inappropriate fantasy. It was real, and it was mutual, and it threatened to destroy everything he had worked his entire life to build. That evening, as he tried to focus on Camilla's recounting of her conversations with various guests, Charles realized that he was going to have to make a choice. He could continue trying to suppress his feelings and maintain the status quo, but that path was becoming increasingly difficult and was already affecting his relationship with Camilla. Or he could find a way to acknowledge what was happening and deal with the consequences, whatever they might be. The summer months brought a series of royal engagements that kept the family traveling throughout the United Kingdom and abroad. Charles welcomed the busy schedule, hoping that the constant activity and public attention would help him regain his emotional equilibrium. But even surrounded by crowds and official duties, he found his thoughts returning to Catherine and the moment they had shared at the garden party. The distance created by their separate schedules should have helped, but Charles discovered that absence was making his feelings stronger rather than weaker. He found himself looking for news about Catherine's activities, reading reports of her engagements with an attention that went far beyond his official interest in family members' work. When photographs appeared in the press showing her at various events, Charles studied them with the intensity of someone trying to decode a secret message. Camilla, meanwhile, was dealing with her own challenges. She had always been perceptive about people's emotions and motivations, and Charles's changed behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. She began asking more direct questions about his preoccupations, and Charles found it increasingly difficult to provide convincing explanations for his distraction. One evening in July, while they were staying at Balmoral for their traditional summer retreat, Camilla finally confronted Charles directly. They had just returned from a long day of official visits in Scotland, and Charles was standing on the terrace overlooking the estate's magnificent grounds. Camilla joined him, and for several minutes they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the hills. Then Camilla spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She told Charles that she knew something had changed in their relationship, and she wanted to understand what was troubling him. She said that she had noticed his distraction, his tendency to avoid certain family gatherings, and his general air of preoccupation with something he wouldn't discuss with her. Charles felt a moment of panic, wondering if Camilla had somehow discovered his feelings for Catherine. But when he looked at her face, he saw concern rather than accusation. She genuinely wanted to help him work through whatever was bothering him, and her kindness made his guilt even more acute. Charles considered telling Camilla the truth, or at least part of it. But he realized that such honesty would only cause pain without solving anything. Instead, he told her that he was struggling with the weight of his responsibilities as king, feeling isolated and uncertain about whether he was living up to the expectations placed on him. This explanation was partially true, though it omitted the most important element of his emotional turmoil. Camilla accepted his words and offered her support, reminding him of all the good work he was doing and the positive changes he was bringing to the monarchy. Her response was loving and supportive, which only made Charles feel worse about the thoughts he was harboring. As they prepared for bed that night, Charles watched Camilla removing her jewelry and preparing for sleep, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been his partner for years. She was a good woman who had adapted her entire life to support his role and his mission. She deserved honesty and faithfulness, not a husband whose heart was wandering toward another woman. The next morning brought news that would force Charles to confront his feelings more directly than he was prepared for. William called to inform him that Catherine had been invited to give a keynote speech at an international conference on early childhood development. The invitation was a significant honor and recognition of her growing expertise in the field, but it would require her to travel alone to Switzerland for several days. William was proud of his wife's achievement, but would be unable to accompany her due to his own commitments. He asked if Charles might consider making a brief appearance at the conference, given his support for Catherine's work and his own involvement in children's charities. The suggestion was logical and appropriate, but Charles knew that traveling with Catherine, even for official purposes, would be dangerous for both of them. Despite his reservations, Charles found himself agreeing to the trip. He told himself that his presence would add gravitas to Catherine's presentation and demonstrate the royal family's commitment to the causes she represented. But he knew that his real motivation was the desire to spend time with Catherine, away from the watchful eyes of family and the familiar constraints of palace life. The conference was being held at a luxury resort in the Swiss Alps, a setting that combined business facilities with stunning natural beauty. Charles and Catherine traveled separately to maintain appropriate protocol, but they were staying at the same hotel and would be working together on several presentations during the 3-day event. When Charles arrived at the hotel, he was struck by the beauty of the location. The resort was nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks with crystal-clear air and the kind of breathtaking scenery that made everyday problems seem small and distant. It was exactly the kind of place where someone might forget about duty and responsibility and focus, instead on personal desires. Catherine had arrived earlier in the day and was already settled into the conference routine. When Charles met her for dinner on his first evening, she seemed more relaxed than he had seen her in months. Perhaps it was the change of scenery, or the excitement of being recognized as an expert in her field. But there was a lightness about her that was incredibly appealing. During dinner, they discussed Catherine's upcoming presentation and the key points she wanted to emphasize. Charles was impressed by her preparation and her deep understanding of the complex issues surrounding early childhood development. As they talked, he found himself forgetting that she was his daughter-in-law and thinking of her simply as an intelligent, passionate woman who shared his commitment to making the world better. After dinner, they walked together through the hotel's gardens, which were beautifully lit and offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. The evening air was cool and fresh, and Charles felt more relaxed than he had in months. Away from the pressures and protocols of royal life, he and Catherine were able to talk freely about their hopes, fears, and dreams. As they walked, Catherine spoke about her children and her concerns about raising them in the public eye. Charles shared his own experiences of growing up as heir to the throne and the challenges he had faced in balancing personal desires with public duty. Their conversation was intimate and honest in ways that Charles rarely experienced with anyone. When they reached a secluded bench overlooking the valley, they sat down to rest and continue their conversation. The setting was romantic, with moonlight reflecting off the mountains and the distant sound of a stream flowing through the valley below. Charles was acutely aware of Catherine sitting beside him, of the warmth of her presence and the subtle scent of her perfume. Without planning it, without even thinking about the consequences, Charles reached out and took Catherine's hand. This time, unlike at the garden party, there was no pretense of helping her navigate an obstacle. It was a deliberate gesture of affection and connection, and Catherine didn't pull away. They sat in silence for several minutes, hands clasped, both of them aware that they had crossed into territory that would be difficult to retreat from. Charles felt a sense of peace and completion that he had never experienced before, as if he had finally found the missing piece of himself that he had been searching for his entire life. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice was soft and uncertain. She said that she cared about him deeply, but she was also confused and frightened by the feelings that had been growing between them. She loved William and didn't want to hurt him or their children, but she couldn't deny that something special existed between her and Charles. Charles understood exactly what she meant, because he was feeling the same conflict between duty and desire, between what was right and what felt inevitable. As they sat together under the stars, he realized that they had reached a point where they would have to make a choice about what came next. The morning after their moonlit conversation in the Swiss gardens, Charles woke with a mixture of joy and terror coursing through his veins. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive and connected to another person, but he also understood the magnitude of what was happening and the potential consequences for everyone involved. Catherine had agreed to meet him for breakfast before her keynote presentation, and Charles knew that their conversation would determine the direction of both their lives. When Catherine arrived at the restaurant, she looked beautiful but troubled. Charles could see that she had slept as poorly as he had, wrestling with the same questions about duty, family, and the unexpected love that had grown between them. They ordered coffee and sat across from each other at a table by the window, the magnificent alpine scenery providing a surreal backdrop to their very real dilemma. Catherine spoke first, her voice careful and measured. She told Charles that she had spent the night thinking about their situation and had come to some difficult conclusions. She acknowledged the connection between them and admitted that her feelings went far beyond what was appropriate for a daughter-in-law, but she also couldn't ignore her responsibilities to William, their children, and the monarchy itself. Charles listened to her words with a heavy heart, because he could see where her reasoning was leading. Catherine was going to choose duty over desire, family stability over personal happiness. It was the right choice, the noble choice, but it felt like a death sentence to Charles, who had finally found the kind of love he had always dreamed of. But then Catherine surprised him. Instead of ending their connection entirely, she suggested that they could continue to work together professionally while being honest about their feelings. She said that she couldn't deny what existed between them, but she also couldn't act on it in ways that would destroy the lives of people they both loved. It was a compromise that acknowledged their reality while maintaining the boundaries that duty required. Charles felt a surge of gratitude and admiration for Catherine's wisdom. She had found a way to honor both their hearts and their responsibilities, a solution that he hadn't been able to see through his own confusion and desire. It wouldn't give them everything they wanted, but it would allow them to remain in each other's lives while protecting the people who depended on them. Catherine's keynote presentation that morning was a triumph. She spoke with passion and expertise about the importance of early childhood development, and her words resonated with the international audience of educators, policymakers, and advocates. Charles watched from the front row, feeling immense pride in her accomplishments and her ability to make a real difference in the world. After the presentation, they had one final private moment together before returning to London. They walked again through the hotel gardens, this time in daylight, and Charles tried to memorize every detail of the setting where he had discovered and then had to partially surrender the great love of his life. Catherine told him that she valued their friendship and their professional partnership above anything else, and that she hoped they could continue to work together on causes they both cared about. Charles assured her that he would respect the boundaries they had established, even though his heart ached at the thought of loving her from a distance. When they returned to London, Charles made a conscious effort to repair his relationship with Camilla. He couldn't give her the passionate love that he felt for Catherine, but he could offer her honesty, respect, and genuine affection. He told her that he had been struggling with feelings of isolation and uncertainty, and he asked for her patience as he worked through these challenges. Camilla, wise and understanding as always, accepted his explanation and his renewed attention with grace. She seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in Charles, but she didn't press for details. Instead, she focused on rebuilding the partnership that had always been the foundation of their relationship. Over the following months, Charles and Catherine continued to collaborate on various charitable projects, always maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while acknowledging the deep connection that existed between them. Their work together was more effective and meaningful than ever, perhaps because it was infused with the intensity of their suppressed feelings. Charles found that channeling his love for Catherine into their shared causes gave his work new purpose and energy. The children's environmental learning centers they had developed together became a model for similar projects around the world, and Catherine's innovative approaches to early childhood education gained international recognition. William remained unaware of the deeper currents running between his father and his wife, seeing only their successful professional collaboration and Catherine's obvious fulfillment in her work. He was proud of both of them for the positive changes they were bringing to their roles and the meaningful impact they were having on causes they cared about. On quiet evenings when Charles was alone in his study, he sometimes allowed himself to think about what might have been if circumstances had been different. If he had met Catherine before she married William, if he hadn't been bound by his marriage, to Camilla if they had been free to explore the love that had grown between them. But these thoughts were brief indulgences, quickly set aside in favor of gratitude for what they did have. Catherine, meanwhile, threw herself into her role with renewed energy and purpose. Her work with children's charities expanded, and she became known as one of the most effective and innovative members of the royal family. She found fulfillment in making a real difference in the world, even if she couldn't have the personal happiness she had glimpsed in Switzerland. The seasons changed, and life at the palace settled into new rhythms. Charles and Camilla found their way to a deeper understanding and acceptance of each other, building a marriage based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than passion. It wasn't the fairy tale romance that either of them had once dreamed of, but it was honest and sustainable. Charles learned to find satisfaction in the small moments of connection he shared with Catherine during their professional work together. A brief touch of hands while reviewing documents, a shared look of understanding during a difficult meeting, the warmth in her voice when she spoke about their projects. These small gifts became precious to him. As winter approached, Charles stood once again at his bedroom window, looking out at the palace gardens. The roses had finished blooming and the trees were bare, but Charles knew that spring would come again, bringing new growth and new possibilities. He had learned that love doesn't always lead to possession, that sometimes the greatest love is expressed through sacrifice and restraint. The story that had begun with Charles looking away from Camilla and taking Catherine's hand had evolved into something more complex and mature. It was a love story, but not in the traditional sense. It was about finding connection and meaning in unexpected places, about choosing duty over desire when necessary, and about the ways that love can transform and ennoble even when it cannot be fully expressed. Charles had taken Catherine's hand, both literally and figuratively, and in doing so had discovered depths of feeling he hadn't known existed. But he had also learned that true love sometimes requires letting go, honoring the needs of others, above your own desires, and finding ways to channel powerful emotions into meaningful work that serves the greater good. The future stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainties and challenges, but also full of possibilities for continued growth and service. Charles knew that his love for Catherine would always be a part of him, a source of inspiration and strength that would influence everything he did as king and as a man. It was not the ending he had once imagined, but it was an ending he could live with, one that honored both his heart and his duty.